Okay, so this is part 2 of my Chapter 12 review. So we're kicking off with the Supreme Court. We've talked about the Marshall Court a little bit before in earlier chapters and in class. This is Chief Justice John Marshall. Fun fact, he is a cousin of Thomas Jefferson. They are not very close. They don't really agree, even when Jefferson is president. Very different political philosophies. So throughout this period of time, Marshall is working to increase the power of the federal government from the bench. So he is working as a Supreme Court justice, right, fulfilling what he says is the duty of the court to interpret the Constitution based on the cases that they see. And just about every time a case comes before him that puts states' powers versus federal government powers, Marshall tended to side with the federal government. And that's just part of his philosophy of how the United States should operate. So here are a series of cases that you should be familiar with. Some of them are landmark cases, as in you should totally know these. McCulloch versus Maryland and Gibbons versus Ogden are biggies to know, but the others fit the theme as well, so they are significant. So let's start with McCulloch v. Maryland. That's 1819. And it really settles in and establishes firmly that the loose construction of the Constitution is a legal precedent. It's something that the court can utilize. So just to remember, that is relying on the elastic clause. Anything that's for the good of the nation can be found or read into the Constitution. This loose construction concept is still a debated sort of thing. When you talk to like court junkies, people who really closely follow the Supreme Court, they can identify themselves pretty quickly as to what they think they are, and you'll notice that some justices, right, or most justices anyway, will talk about how they feel about that. From the fact that the late Justice Scalia would tell you very firmly that he is a strict constructionist, and he did not think that there was any flexibility to be found in the Constitution, that the framers wrote what they meant, and they meant what they wrote, and that's all there was to it. And there are other examples, like John Marshall, who would say that national good changes over time, and so the Constitution has to be flexible enough to bend to fit the situation without snapping. Cohens versus Virginia, 1821, that establishes and reaffirms the supremacy of the Supreme Court, the federal Supreme Court, over state Supreme Courts. The Supreme Court of Virginia had made a decision, and it was appealed to the federal Supreme Court, and part of the decision that was handed down, it was reaffirmed that yes, in fact, the federal Supreme Court can review decisions made by lower Supreme Courts and could overturn them or uphold them as they see fit. Gibbons v. Ogden of 1824, Congress is the only entity that can regulate interstate commerce. So that's I-N-T-E-R, in between state commerce. The case with Gibbons v. Ogden had to do with the state of New York setting up a monopoly with steamships to move cargo back and forth from other states, and that's not okay. States can't regulate or make decisions about trade in between states. That's a federal issue because it deals with states interacting with each other. Intrastate commerce is a state issue. That's I-N-T-R-A. Trade inside the state is the state's issue. Trade from that state to other states or other places is a federal issue. Fletcher versus Peck in 1810. It reaffirms the right of the Supreme Court to review state laws that might conflict with the Constitution. So just like if the federal Congress passes something that doesn't agree with the Constitution, the Supreme Court can review and decide its constitutionality. That applies to state laws as well. You might be seeing now why Jefferson really does not agree with John Marshall, given his track history with nullification and the Virginia and Kentucky resolves. And Dartmouth College has to do with contracts. All right, state legislatures can't overturn contracts that have to do with federal issues, and they can't overturn contracts that have to do with interstate issues. So, but at the end of the day, the deal with the John Marshall Court is loose constructionism. Okay, so to finish out that thought, Marshall is definitely a Hamiltonian, and the Hamiltonian vision gets carried through into the future. Right? Of the two, Jefferson and Hamilton, Jefferson's vision for America is closer to what we have today than Jefferson's vision for America. Jefferson really thought that the United States would be populated by gentlemen farmers who each had their own plot of land, and they'd be very moral, and everyone would be kept honest because they're all invested in economic endeavor and taking care of their own house and farm. Hamilton had this more intense vision of trade and credit and every man an economic actor, right? And a really strong central government, a strong banking system. All the things that we enjoy today are mostly a Hamiltonian vision for the country. So let's finish this out with James Monroe. All right, so remember, he's still president. We're an era of good feelings. There's a lot of things happening internationally that start to impact the United States, and as a young country, we're not quite equipped to handle the things that are going on. Movements for independence and revolutions start breaking out in Latin America. So Chile, Venezuela, Argentina, Spain is trying to put down these rebellions in what are their colonies. They're pulling troops from Florida to try and get those rebellions put down. Right? So within the United States, one, we love revolutionary rhetoric. We believe in this idea of democracies. We're not equipped to help anybody, though. So the Latin American countries are kind of on their own. We're like, yay, yay, independence, but we're not doing much to send aid or troops or anything like that. But this gives us an opportunity. Andrew Jackson's going to come back in here in a second. So Spain is pulling their troops out of Florida. Remember, in the early 1800s, Florida is still Spanish, right? America has taken a little bit of West Florida, but the rest of it is still Spanish. And they're pulling troops out to try and push them into these colonies. They're closer in Florida. Let's deploy them. Which, it makes sense. But that leaves an opening. And Andrew Jackson, being Andrew Jackson, is like, yes, I see potential here. So he gets a commission from the federal government to try and subdue what he says are violent Native Americans and free blacks in Florida. He thinks, or he presents the situation that suggests there are dangers there. But he really steps past the limits of his commission to gain some power for himself. That tells you a little bit about Andrew Jackson, I think. He overthrows the Spanish royal governor and kind of installs himself as kind of a military leader of Florida for a little while. Not so great. That's brought back to the feds. And James Monroe and John Quincy Adams, they're not like delighted with this situation because Jackson has gone way off the plantation with this one. Right? But they kind of used the situation to secure a treaty with the Spanish, the Adams-O'Neill Treaty. So the United States gets Florida, which we're okay with. The Spanish are more concerned about revolutions in Latin America than they are hanging on to this little bit of territory in the United States. The Adams-O'Neill Treaty does basically three things for us. We get Florida, the remaining section that the United States did not already own. It defines the western edge of the Louisiana Territory. Before this treaty, we kind of just presumed it was everything west of the Mississippi, and that's not really the case, so we made some arranging there. And then the U.S. agrees to leave Texas. We're going to say, fine, whatever, and it just becomes a part of Mexico, which eventually becomes an independent thing as well. We do, of course, re-obtain it, right, the Mexican-American War, but that's a story for another day. Okay. But this rise of revolutions in the area, the interactions with Spain, and some actions by Russia that's kind of slow, like Russia is slowly creeping into other places. They're an imperialist nation as well, don't forget it. The United States is in this interesting position because we're aware right? That there are things happening in the world that are going to be impacting us here at home, and how are we going to deal with that? James Monroe has, I don't know, let's call it a light bulb moment. And when he's giving a speech to Congress, his annual message to Congress, he includes something that becomes known as the Monroe Doctrine. Just for clarity's sake, the annual message to Congress originally was not delivered in person. Monroe would have written this, and it would have been read aloud by someone else in Congress. It wasn't the big sort of dog and pony show that it is today. But Monroe's message includes two really important ideas that come to define American foreign policy after Washington's Declaration of Neutrality and all the way up until like Teddy Roosevelt, really, right, to the 1890s. And our concepts here are, the first, non-colonization. Right, so old world powers are no longer welcome to expand into the new world. This bit is mostly targeted at Russia because they're kind of getting active in Canada's tail, right? So they're near Alaska, and in fact own Alaska for quite a while. But we're telling them, just stay out. This is our space. Okay? And the second key concept here is non-intervention. The United States says very firmly that the U.S. is going to deal with events in the Western Hemisphere. This is our territory. Europe, don't intervene. Europe, stay over there. We got this. Now, the funny part of that is we did not have this. Okay? The U.S. did not have a strong enough Navy. We did not have a strong enough military. There was literally no way we could have enforced the Monroe Doctrine. At the time that it was said, it was kind of like, okay, yeah, all right. It's not until later that this is taken as a statement of belief and a statement of philosophy and even a statement of policy. That happens a little further down the line. So it had very, very little impact when it was actually first put out for Congress. Right? And in fact, we're relying on the British. So had anyone tried to invade in the United States or intervene in the Western Hemisphere, we would be relying on our dear friends and sometime enemies, the British, to step in and make sure that nothing actually happened. It gives an illusion of isolationism that is present, right, all the way through the late 1800s and turn of the century into the 1900s. But it is one of the most important policy documents of the early United States. So it's very important that you're familiar with this one for the AP test because it would be excellent for a question. Okay, I hope this has helped at least a little bit. Okay, thanks, bye.